Good afternoon. I hope we are going to make it easier for you to digest your lunch after. Sorry for having to make this presentation at this particular time. Now, this paper represents my thinking at what is the initial stage of some work I'm attempting to do on what I call revisiting the Carib story. I've used the word Carib deliberately since my focus is going to be on the historical literature, and I'm mindful of the confusion that exists in determining precisely who were the Kalinago and Garifuna peoples. I must draw to your attention that the citation which was read at the official declaration conferring the honor of national hero refers to Chatelier as the paramount chief of the Kalinago people. There were two things that prompted this desire to revisit the story. First was a conversation that I had with a woman of Carib ancestry who was decrying the fact that they still taught students in school that the Caribs were cannibals. She told me that her young daughter was totally distraught by this. The second thing that motivated me had to do with my research on Chatelier in an effort to add support to his claim to be worthy of national hero status. This involved having to do some serious detective work, trying to piece together a picture of the man from documents largely written by his detractors, who have really shaped and influenced our information about Chatelier and about the Carib peoples. Now, I'm just at the point of re-examining the historical literature, and must make the point that each era influences the kinds of questions you take to an examination of the documents. I'm aware, among other things, of the divisions within the Carib community. My task, therefore, was to look at the problematics that exist in that story. My observations are obviously not new, because different scholars over the years have identified some of them. In an article in Caribbean Quarterly in its December 1973 issue, Bernard Marshall, in introducing his article, The Black Caribs' Native Resistance to British Penetration into the Windward Side of St. Vincent, 1763 to 1773, Bernard Marshall stated the following, and I quote, "Indeed, an article of this nature is very timely and necessary, since to date, that is 1973, or 200 years after the event, the popular work on this subject is still that of Sir William Young, who published his history in the year 1795. To date, this work has completely distorted the picture, but has remained virtually unchallenged. But no one has yet attempted to refute Young's arguments by a thorough re-examination of the available data," end of quote. Peter Hulme, 22 years later in 2005, was to go back to the same issue. In reference to the removal of the Caribs from St. Vincent, he wrote, and again I quote, "Once that removal had taken place, the only voices who wanted to tell the story, their story of suffering and eventual triumph, were the British planters and their allies." He noted that the planters' version entered the literature as historical truth, where it has never been seriously challenged. Marshall had drawn upon the work of Elsa Govaya in her study on the historiography of the British West Indies, published in 1956. Govaya drew attention to the fact that Young's book was dedicated to Drury Otley, the colony's agent in England, who was trying to secure the deportation of the Black Caribs from St. Vincent. His work, which he described as a piece of settler history, was part of the effort to have the Caribs expelled from St. Vincent to accommodate the planters' desire for land. Charles Shepard's An Historical Account of St. Vincent was the other work that has continued to influence our views on the Caribs, even though Kirby and Martin had attempted, using the information provided by Young and Shepard, to provide an interpretation from a Vincentian perspective. Shepard, in his work, states clearly that it was commissioned by the planters and soldiers. His work was dedicated to the survivors of the Carib War, the record of their services and of their departed companions in arms. These writings by people who were clearly antagonistic to the Caribs have added to the earlier versions of cannibalism and influenced our thinking on the whole history of the Caribs. So what was told about the Caribs at that particular time was transported to an overall picture of the life of the Caribs. What we have not done enough about is to access French documents. Peter Hulme argues that, and I quote again, even recent historiography, most skeptical of these British versions, has contented itself with reading them and other British documentation against the grain rather than seeking alternative or contemporary accounts. Work being done in Belize and in Central America, although largely focused on the period after their arrival, is therefore of importance. Hulme has contributed to the process of seeking alternative and contemporary accounts by introducing, as he described it, two previously ignored French voices into the debate. The two are Emmanuel Francois, Marquis of Lambert, with his History of the Caribs, Savage Nation that Inhabits the Windwards and Part of the Continent. Lamberty was part of the French Antilles service in the 1750s and traveled to St. Vincent. His document, written in France in 1760, gives perhaps, according to Hulme, the fullest extant account of Carib life in the middle of the 18th century. This is a French source. The second voice was that of Alexandre Moreau de Jean, whose memoir of his career as a soldier, entitled Adventures of War in the Time of the Republic and of the Consulate, was published in 1858. His service included a 3-month visit to St. Vincent, where he was involved in the military training of Carib forces. It is Hulme's view that during those 3 months at the end of 1795, Moreau certainly lived in much closer contact with the Vincentian Caribs than any outsider at this time, possibly during the whole course of the 18th century. The point I'm making here is that we have neglected the French sources, but in a situation where the French had a much closer contact with the Caribs than the English. We must, however, bear in mind the point that Hulme makes, where he says that neither of these French sources is in any simple sense authoritative, with Moreau, for instance, writing as a friend of the Caribs. The Historical and Archaeological Society of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, now dormant, with the help of the French Embassy and a former director of the archives in St. Vincent, now living in France, was the recipient of French official documents, some of which have already been translated. The Miro Environmental Development Organization, spearheaded by Father Marc de Silva, and with the help of UNESCO, the French Embassy, and the Archives and Historical Society of Martinique, was able to have translated and published a work by Father Adrian Le Breton, historic account of St. Vincent, the Indian Yurumi, the island of the Caribbees. The document that was based on his observation during his stay in St. Vincent from 1693 to 1702 was discovered in Paris by Father Robert Devon and left in the care of a local barrister. It has formed the basis of this book. French missionaries were among the early European contacts with the Caribs. Extracts from some of their works were included in Wild Majesty, the anthology edited by Hulme and Neil Whitehead in 1992. We have, however, not really paid as much attention as we should to even those French sources which have been available in English. Although we have to be guarded about their own biases, they should help researchers to present a more balanced story of the Caribs. We have also to take into account the different kinds of relationships held by the British and French with the Caribs. The French, despite their periods of conflict, were by the mid-18th century enjoying a closer relationship with the Caribs, some of them even living among the Caribs, trading with the Caribs, and also providing military training and equipment. The relationship with the British was not as close and was much more antagonistic. The British focus in the 18th century being on the acquisition of Carib lands for the establishment of sugar. The wars of 1772 to 1773 and 1795 to 1796 and the conflicts between 1763 and 1772 and 1773 and 1795 are testimony to this. There are issues in the traditional story of the Caribs that need to be looked at again. One of them is of special importance now, given the fact that we are once more about to celebrate the anniversary of the declaration of Joseph Chatier as first national hero of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And this has to do with the death of Chatier. The traditional account, which has been accepted almost uncritically, is that given by Charles Shepherd. Shepherd writes, and I quote from him, "On the side of the enemy, several of the French and Caribs lay dead on the field. Among the latter was Chatier, the commander-in-chief of all the forces. Cruelty rather than courage had always been the principle of this man's conduct. He therefore fell unregretted in a single combat with brave Major Leith of the militia." Ebenezer Duncan, in his brief history of St. Vincent, drew attention to the placement on the large chandelier in Anglican Cathedral in Kingston of a memorial stone placed on the grave of the Major. In Wild Majesty, Holm provides a photograph of Alexander Leith's tombstone. But there's something strange about this account, to my mind. Given the practice of the Caribs in fighting guerrilla-type warfare, one has to ask about the circumstances under which Chatier, in the early morning of March 15th, would have been engaged in a hand-to-hand combat with Major Leith. There are two official accounts of the circumstances under which Chatier was killed that have come to my attention. One account, which appeared to have been taken from the St. Vincent Gazette, is entitled "Extracts from the Narrative of the Insurrection in the Island of St. Vincent." The report states, and I must point out that when you look at these reports, what they really speak about was an ambush. And I quote, "The party met and formed at Hartle's house at 12 o'clock on the night of the 14th instant, consisting of detachment from His Majesty's ships, the Zebra and Roebuck. The word march was given at 12 o'clock and cheerfully obeyed. The whole party mounting in the preceding order the steep and rugged path in regularity and silence. They ascended within 80 yards of the main post when they were discovered, challenged, and fired. As soon as the party had got up within 20 yards of the enemy, orders were given to fire a volley and charge. They were obeyed. The buildings in which the enemy sheltered themselves were stormed, and such of them as made resistance were put to the bayonet. Many escaped through the darkness of the night. The principal share of honor undoubtedly fell to Captain Skinner and Lieutenant Hill of the Zebra, to whom the service owes infinite obligation. On the side of the enemy, Chatier, the Caribs' chief, was killed, with several other Caribs and inhabitants of French extractions subjects to His Majesty, end of quote. The other is a letter from Governor Seaton, dated March the 16th. In his letter, after dealing with similar information to what was contained in the first document, mentioned, he simply ends by stating that Chatier, the Caribs, and some French men were killed, 25 wounded, 50 made prisoners, and 2 pieces of cannon were taken, end of quote. Now, interestingly, in these two official accounts, nothing is mentioned about Major Leith. and the supposed duel with Chatelier. In a booklet on Chatelier published in 2002, I wrote the following: "It seems quite obvious that this was meant to be a propaganda tool, demonstrating their superiority with the claim that their major defeated the exceptional Chatelier." What is of interest in these accounts of the death of Chatelier, and also in that presented by Shepard, is that Chatelier died in the early hours of March 15th, not March 14th, as we have always believed. The account stated that the party met at 12 o'clock on March 14th, and that the order to march was given at 12:15. This is the morning of March 15th. Now, this is not an attempt to call for a change of date, National Heroes Day, but simply for us to set the historical record straight. One of the other problematic issues that calls for some redefining and clarification has to do with the relationship between the so-called Red and Black Caribs. This is of concern to me because of the divisions within the Carib community and the confusion as to who are representatives of the Kalinagos and the Garifuna people. Nancy Gonzalez, in an article in Samuel Wilson's edited The Indigenous People of the Caribbean, makes the following important statement, and I quote her: "My studies indicate that by the middle of the 18th century, the Black Caribs of St. Vincent were culturally and biologically indistinguishable from the so-called Yellow Caribs." And I think that's an important point. My studies indicate that by the middle of the 18th century, the Black Caribs of St. Vincent were culturally and biologically indistinguishable from the so-called Yellow Caribs. Yet European observers, burdened by a racist imagination and ignorant of Mendelian genetics, insisted on distinguishing between darker, more combative Caribs and lighter, more tractable ones, and in imposing policies that preserved that distinction, end of quote. Mendelian genetics could, of course, account for the different shades of color rather than be an indication of membership of one group or the other, which is the point that Gonzalez is trying to make. In her earlier 1998 work, Sojourners of the Caribbean, she stated that by 1763, Island Carib had become Black Carib, and contrary to what has previously been believed, the Afro-European overlay was probably structurally significant. The ecological setting had also changed, of course, for both island and Black Carib territory had been severely diminished, and the former raiding and trading networks with other Caribbean-speaking peoples had been largely replaced by war and trade with Europeans, end quote. The historical literature has always attempted to play up the divisions between the Black and Red Caribs. In 1700, it appeared that there was a plan by the French to sell the Negroes in the French colonies or to send them to be sold by the Spanish. And I have to quote something which was quoted by one of the previous speakers. The French intendant, Roubaud, warned about the difficulty involved in attempting that enterprise. The Negroes, he states, were settled on the windward side of the island, which was difficult to access. It was more practicable to land on the leeward side and make one's way inland to cross the island to the windward part where the Negroes are. He doubts, however, that the Red Caribs would ever have allowed that, since it is a very steadfast sentiment that they prefer to see 2,000 Negroes settled in their island than to see disembarking here only 50 armed Frenchmen. When Captain John Brathwaite attempted in 1722 to lay claim to St. Vincent on behalf of the Duke of Montagu, he had audience on board his ship with the chiefs of the Black and Red Caribs. They told him that it was good that he had not mentioned his mission when they were ashore, for they would not have been able to protect him. The Dutch, they said, had attempted it before, but were glad to retire. They told him, too, that the day before he came, the French had been among them and had offered them arms and ammunition and assured them of protection against the English by the forces in Martinique. They declared, however, that they would trust no Europeans, that they owned themselves under the protection of the French, but would as soon oppose to their settling amongst them or any act of force from them as us, as they had lately given an example by killing several of them. Moreau, in the account of his visit to St. Vincent 1795, wrote about having been met by the chief of the Red Caribs, and then taken to a village where there was a communal house containing an assembly hall at least 80 feet long. He says, there I found gathered together the chiefs and warriors of the two tribes, the Red and the Black Caribs. What I'm suggesting here is that the divisions between the Red and Black Caribs seem to have been exaggerated and projected over the whole span of the existence of these two groups. The role of the Red Caribs in the 1795 war against the English has been downplayed. But Moreau, who had gone to St. Vincent to assist the Caribs with military training, encountered both Red and Black Caribs. He puts emphasis on the skills of the women. Morning Star and Flower of the Forest, granddaughters of the chief of the Black Caribs, he said, never missed the target once. He had enjoyed the hospitality of Pakiri, the chief of the Red Caribs. The fame of Eliama, the daughter of the Red Carib chief, was known to him before from our exploits in Guadeloupe, some of which he described. She had rendered, he said, many such services to the inhabitants of Guadeloupe and Martinique. Of the Red Carib chief, he said that, and I quote, the defense of his country and the happiness of his daughter were his life. He had been called back to Guadeloupe, but returned later to find that the residents of the village where he resided were all killed by the British. This included the Carib chief and his daughter. He attributed the reasons for their defeat as the enemy's greater numbers, the late arrival of help from Guadeloupe, and above all, the employment by General Abercrombie of a battalion of Negroes raised in Martinique and commanded by two Creoles accustomed to hunting slaves in the woods. These Negroes crept through passages believed to be inaccessible, and getting to the rear of the military positions, they reached the redoubt, which served as a refuge for women and children and a storehouse for ammunition and food. The British had also been able to get valuable information about the defense of the Caribs from one of their captains. Now, Nancy Gonzalez might very well have been right in suggesting that by the middle of the 18th century, the Black Caribs were culturally and biologically indistinguishable from the Yellow Caribs. Carib society would not have been static and would have responded to different stimuli over the years. The arrival of Africans would have ensured changes in the society as it was with the arrival of the Europeans. The period after 1763, when the British quest for land was a major driving force, would have stimulated even further changes in an effort to meet the British challenge. While there are other issues such as cannibalism, the origins of the Black Caribs, and the attempt to explain language by suggesting a massacre by the Caribs of Arawak men, even though those are points which we need to pay particular attention to because there's still a lot of confusion and uncertainty in the literature, the final point I want to add to this preliminary excursion into what I've set out to do is to draw reference to the scant attention paid to the Carib impact on Vincentian life and culture, even after the exile had robbed the community of some of its most robust and enterprising people. I will only identify a few. Their impact on the foods we eat and on our culinary habits, mentioning briefly the preparation of cassava, arroot, in particular modongo, and the catching of tritri. And I've seen a document describing how the Caribs were catching treachery, and realized that the very same way the Caribs caught the treachery or catching the treachery is the very same method we use today. Then there's also their involvement on the rough windward coast in getting the sugar out with their boats, the larger ships waiting outside, and Black Point is testimony to this. T.B.C. Musgrave, in his historical and descriptive sketch in 1891, prepared at the time of the Jamaican exhibition, writes, "They earn their living as boatmen or fishermen in cultivating small patches of garden ground for themselves, and as basket makers, an art in which they excel, and which they are said to have preserved from the teaching of their ancestors. These baskets, which are made in nests, fitting into one another, are so constructed as to be watertight and to last for years. The people are perfectly fearless on the water and are the principal boatmen employed in shipping sugar on the dangerous windward coast." The Caribs represented St. Vincent at different imperial exhibitions. R.M. Anderson in the St. Vincent Handbook quoted from the Colonial Standard and Jamaican Dispatch in its report on the 1891 exhibition in Jamaica that the 6 Caribs from St. Vincent occupied a hut in the village of the exhibition grounds. They attracted a lot of attention as they demonstrated their basket-making skills. His Excellency and Lady Blake were, we were told, often visitors at the courts and always evinced great interest in the work of the Caribs. At the 1884 forestry exhibition in Edinburgh, Scotland, St. Vincent received a silver medal for the general collection of exhibits and 2 bronze medals, one for fibers and basket and wicker work, the other for a model of a dugout canoe, all of these being made by the Caribs. Finally, I want to make a call for more research on the contribution of the Caribs to black theater in New York. The play, The Drama of King Shotaway, described as founded on facts taken from the Carib insurrection, was performed in New York in 1823, period of slavery in St. Vincent in the Caribbean and also in America. And written, it is said, from the experience of a Mr. Brown, who from all indications was a Carib, and who obviously thought that the story of Chatouillet needed to be told. Unfortunately, the script which should have told us a lot about Chatouillet has never been found. The play is said to be the first about a black man performed in New York, and Mr. Brown is called the father of the black theater. So, the point I'm trying to make is that while we need to revisit the Carib story, there are also quite a lot of other things that have to be told. And I should also mention that not a lot of attention has been paid to what happened to those Caribs after 1797, because there were these Carib communities existing, and there's a lot of information on that. So a lot of research work to be done, and a call for a thorough re-examination of the Carib story. This work, as I said, is preliminary and is presented here today as such. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Dr. Fraser for his presentation. At this time, Dr. Michael Denny received his PhD from John